Hi, this is Paul. Every week I never quite know what videos I'm going to make, and sometimes things pop up in the news feed that grab my attention. I think, oh, I really want to talk about this. One of these was the Galli report. Mark Galli, who's the former editor of Christianity Today. I used to read his Galli report when he was at Christianity Today. Has sort of moved it over to Substack. And I didn't catch anything was up until a friend of mine liked a tweet by Caitlin Beatty. This was an odd read. I respect Mark a lot, but I have no idea he held some of these views while leading Christianity Today. Not the least that staff were towing a more radical feminist view, and that Doug Wilson is a model of leadership, even if idiosyncratic. In other words, horror. Well, this piece written by Mark Galli was quite an eye-opener. Nope, there's the Mark Galli, former editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, decided to become Catholic. This was an interview on Word on Fire of Mark Galli. That's not what I was talking about. I'm talking about this piece, which I'm going to read. The State of Evangelical Leadership. The article subtitled American Evangelicalism is at Crossroads. Accommodate the culture and politics of liberalism or embrace the political demands of the gospel by Jackson Water and Emma Posey. Offers a lot of wisdom, but it tries a little too hard to make something of a coincidence. The coincidence was a Christianity Today sponsored conversation between Russell Moore and Beth Moore, no relation, and a conference on the politics of sex led by provocateur Doug Wilson, both held concurrently in Nashville, Tennessee in September. Nashville, Tennessee seems to be sort of the epicenter of a lot of things these days. The author attempts to make the case that these two groups, Christianity Today and the constellation of reactionary Reformed conservatives surrounding Doug Wilson, represent the two likely paths evangelicalism can take moving forward. Now, a thesis of mine has been for a while, and I started making a PowerPoint about this, that, well, let me just run it down without all the pretty pictures of PowerPoint. So if you go all the way back to the Civil War, you basically have the North's victory over the South and a new post-millennial evangelicalism that is dominating the national Protestant religious scene, which is the religious scene of North America. You can read about this in George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture. That splits, and a big part of the split is the continued rise of Darwinism, science sort of displacing, I would call, the mental hash that is, well, maybe it's better to call the universal history that Americans in the middle of the 19th century sort of had about their picture of the world. And so then you get this divide that Marsden writes very well about between the fundamentalists and the modernists. And that continues into the 20th century. A lot of denominations, a lot of institutions split up over this. And again, read Marsden's Fundamentalism and American Culture. Now, as you get into the beginning of the 20th century, those splits continue to happen. You have old Protestant, old Princeton, and they, of course, that will get harrowed by the liberalism, and that will become Westminster East. You've just got a lot of stuff going on there. And you have the fundamentalist modernist split that is sort of dominating everything. Well, coming out of the Second World War, especially a little bit before it, you have Neo-Evangelicalism, and you can the handoff sort of goes from George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture into Molly Worthen's Apostles of Reason. So the Neo-Evangelicals really start to try to bridge this divide. Now, a lot of the divide, I just have to go to the PowerPoint. A really nice articulation of the fall of the main line is in James Wellman's High on God, where he talks about Fourth Presbyterian in Chicago. Fourth Presbyterian at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century was a leading church in the city. The mayor would talk to the pastor in order to basically figure out how to run the city. Christian ministers, churches had that much influence. They were that foundational to cities and the society. And what Wellman really nicely articulates is basically the fall of the main line. Now, pastors don't really regain status in America like they had before, but they tend to be kept around as window dressing to one degree or another. Billy Graham being a spiritual advisor to many presidents during the Cold War is an example of this. But the spiritual advising that happened to these presidents during the Cold War, for example, didn't stop Richard Nixon from doing what Richard Nixon did. Now, what you have then in the 80s is a changing of the guard in terms of top status Christian ministers from the main line to the evangelicals. For example, one of Bill Hybels' spiritual mentors was, one of Bill Clinton's spiritual members was Bill Hybels. That didn't stop Bill Clinton from doing what he did. But you very much see the mega churches as taking over the mantle. Now, a big part of this with politicians has to be the simple fact that these megachurch pastors are celebrity pastors, and via their books and at that point tape ministries via the Willow Creek Association, these people spoke to and were tremendously influential in the hearts and minds of a lot of people. And this is why politicians paid attention to them. And this is why early in the 20th century, what then would become the main line, which was at the beginning of the 20th century, fairly evangelical still. Look at the the sort of the tales of evangelicalism. The main line continued to hold a lot of the population, and that has been diminishing all through the 20th century and continues to now. So in the 80s and 90s, the mega churches and the celebrity pastors like Bill Hybels was Bill Clinton's spiritual advisor. Rick Warren gave the prayer at Barack Obama's first inaugural address. Now, for Obama's second inaugural, there was this drama around the fact that, the staff probably thought, well, we'll keep working the mainline pastors, but by 2012, horror of horror, mainline pastors were out of step with marriage equality. So mainline pastors had to be disinvited, and now affirming same-sex marriage will now be table stakes for any clergy that will appear on Democratic platforms. There's a lot going on here, way more than this little short video, which is sort of a run-up to Galli's piece. Now, as I've mentioned before, this terrific article on Patheos, How the Civil Rights Movement Converted Liberal White Protestants to Secularism, is a really important thing. And the mega churches, big box evangelicalism, really slid in and took the place of the main line as sort of the white, middle-class, college-educated form of church going in America. Very suburban. Okay, and via the book deals, via the conferences that these pastors did, they were the ones that were really, in many ways, shaping the American church, at least in terms of Protestantism, because mainline just continued to crater. And this, of course, sort of coincided with the Reagan Revolution, sort of a neoconservatism of Reagan's revolution, and the seeker movement really believed at that point that they could evangelize the world. Now, after the seeker movement, when you look at Safe Place to Hear a Dangerous Message, that's one of Bill Hybels' mantras. You had a safe suburban secular front. The Willow Creek campus sort of looked like a junior college, but it was evangelical to the core. It was conversionist. Willow Creek went egalitarian, but again, as far as we're going to read in Galli, even someone like Alyssa Childers, who is, when we get into the question of Christian music, she's, what was her father's name? I listened to his record when I was young, Chuck Girard. Alyssa Childers is Chuck Girard's daughter, which is a very, very interesting connection. So there are always these little adjustments, but you have this question of things indifferent with respect to relevance realization. So that's as far as I got on the PowerPoint. So let's switch back to the Galli's piece. So basically what happens is that the seeker movement, I remember I went to the Willow Creek Church Conference twice. And at the second time I went, we visited the Gen X worship service. So basically, the seekers believed they had it all dialed in terms of how to win the nation with respect to the baby boomers. But the Gen Xers were proving a little bit tougher to corner. And so basically, in sort of the seeker style, where they employed business methods and sociology, and again, all of this stuff is well documented by Molly Worthen's Apostles of Reason. They figured if they just did the market research and the sociology on the Gen Xers, then they could just move around all the embroidery and window dressings and land the Gen Xers just like they were landing the boomers. Okay, that was the deal with the seeker movement. Well, the Gen Xers weren't going to have it. And what emerges from there is the so-called emergent movement. And so at the beginning of the emergent movement, you have groups that would eventually really turn away from each other. You think about Rachel Held Evans and Mark Driscoll. Groups that would eventually become real foes were sort of all in it together at the beginning of the emergent movement. And that's such recent history, there really isn't a lot of good history written on it because it's sort of unfolding right now. But that was critical because the emergent movement sort of split into the young, restless, and reformed and the progressive evangelicals. And so if you look at someone like Caitlin Beatty, now these are all on spectrums, mind you, progressive evangelicals. And then you look at, so she'd be somewhere in the progressive evangelical camp. And you look at someone like Doug Wilson, he'd sort of be on an extreme of the young, restless, and reformed movement. Now, a third thing is going to come out of the emergent movement, which will be what I call the neo-sacramentalists. But that's a little bit later, okay? And so Galli, he's of retirement age. He's just become Roman Catholic. Now it's time for him to speak his truth about what he saw in evangelicalism towards the end of his time as editor of Christianity Today. Now, it's really difficult to undersell the importance of Christianity Today to Neo-Evangelicalism. Now, after the Second World War, you really had the rise of the magazine as an engine of deep political clout and deep social clout. And Christianity Today, as some pieces that I read in Molly Worthen's Apostles of Reason, Christianity Today, there was nothing else like it. And so you have, I should just pull up. This is what happens when I don't make a PowerPoint. Okay, let's talk here a little bit about Molly Worthen's definition of evangelical, because that's actually fairly important. A logical place to start is to ask Christians who call themselves evangelicals what they believe. The trouble is that evangelicals differ widely in how they interpret and emphasize fundamental doctrines. Even the born-again experience, supposedly the quintessence of evangelicalism, is not an ironclad indicator. Some evangelicals have always viewed conversion as an incremental process rather than an instantaneous rebirth, and their numbers may be increasing. History, rather than theology or politics, is the most useful tool for pinning down today's evangelicals. Molly Worthen's book, Apostles of Reasons, is fundamentally a historical book. If evangelicalism encompasses a wide spectrum of believers, they share a common heritage in revivals and moral crusades of the 18th and 19th century. It's no stretch to trace these roots all the way back to European pietists' zeal for private Bible study, personal holiness, following on the heels of the Protestant Reformation. Evangelical catchphrases like Bible believing and born again are modern translations of the Reformer slogan sola scriptura and pietist emphasis on internal spiritual transformation. Evangelicals share this history, and they also share a set of fundamental questions. Why they differ from one another on the details of these ideas about God and mankind, while they disagree, three elemental concerns unite them. How to repair the fracture between spiritual and rational knowledge, how to assure salvation and a true relationship with God, and how to resolve the tension between the demands of personal belief and the constraints of secularized public square. These are the problems of intellectual and spiritual authority. None on its own is unique to evangelicals, but in combination, under the pressures of Western history and in the absence of a magisterial arbiter capable of settling uncertainties and disagreements, these concerns have shaped a distinct spiritual community. This is a historian's definition meant to account for the patterns of history rather than a believer's self-description that tries to relay evangelicals' internal perspective in language that they might themselves use. American evangelicals have a strong primitivist bent. They often prefer to think of their faith as indistinguishable from the faith of Christ's apostles and scoff at history's claims on them, but they are creatures of history just like everyone else, whether they like it or not. So Christianity today really becomes, I'd say, between the rise of magazines and their fall, which happens with the internet, really becomes sort of the quintessential organ of American evangelicalism. That and the Billy Graham evangelistic crusade, or evangelistic organization. So Mark Galli is editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, although actually, he's not Carl F. Henry. Actually, after the basically as the sunset of magazines in general goes down, still this is a very big deal. And for him to convert to Catholicism after he retires was a huge deal. So now he's talking about this article, which is, so in very rough outlines, if you want to sort of keep track of this historically, look at the end of the Civil War to the interwar period as the height of the modernist fundamentalist movement. In the interwar period, especially in the wake of World War II and the rise of the Cold War, you have the rise of the Neo-Evangelicals, which, again, how do we know that they are, in a sense, they have the commanding heights of the culture in many ways, to the degree that any church does in that period? It's because Billy Graham is the spiritual advisor to presidents during the Cold War, and the handoff goes to mega churches, to Bill Hybels and Rick Warren. And then you have the rise of the emergent movement, which will then split into the young, restless, and reformed, the neo-reformed, as they're sometimes called, even though my Dutch Calvinism sort of embraces that tag, going back to Abram Kuyper and Herman Bavinck. And basically their fall, partly because of the same-sex marriage. Suddenly same-sex marriage becomes table stakes for at least public stagecraft in the Democratic Party. The authors attempt to make the case that these two groups, Christianity Today and the constellation of reactionary Reformed conservatives surrounding Doug Wilson, represent the two likely paths evangelicalism can take forward. Now, again, that's not unusual given the fact that the emergent movement has already split there. You have Nadia Bolz-Weber, you've got Mark Driscoll, and you've got Rachel Held Evans. Now, Rachel Held Evans is clearly going to tack towards Nadia Bolz-Weber. Now, Rachel Held Evans is again deceased, but you've got Russell Moore and Beth Moore, and they're sort of much more in the moderate waters. That split hasn't really happened yet. And, well, I'll keep reading. The authors are right about Christianity Today being one of these, but Doug Wilson and his followers are a tiny and inconsequential part of the evangelical movement, and I think Galli is exactly right. Recent accusations of sex and wife abuse in Wilson's Moscow, Idaho community will only sideline that movement even more. And part of what is happening with the rise and fall, remember, so magazines are dead. Long live the podcast. The rise and fall of Mars Hill is in some ways Christianity Today's most significant effort to outlive the magazine as a vital organ of American influence. And when Rise and Fall of Mars Hill hit the top of the charts on iTunes podcast. Now, iTunes podcast is, because the podcast world is so disseminated still, we'll have to see if Spotify or Apple or Google managed to sort of corral and monopolize that space, as has been done for many other spaces on the internet. iTunes podcast is about one of the few indicators of a podcast that is having a tremendous amount of influence. So to have the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill hit a point like that is a big deal. And the subject matter of it is not inconsequential. And so the debates within the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill are going to be interesting. Now, someone, I forget where, could be in my comment section or on Twitter, quipped, we're going to have to talk about the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. I would dare bet the podcast has lost a lot of ground. But the issues that the podcast wishes to address are not only salient within evangelicalism, but salient within the nation. Okay. Still, there's insight in this piece. The direction Moore, columnist David French, and Russell Moore, columnist David French, and Beth Moore are walking is not simply traditional evangelicalism. I don't know if there's such a thing as simply traditional evangelicalism, because evangelicalism has always been an attempt to bridge something and to hold some tensions together. And what you're going to find with a movement like that is it's always going to be pulled one way or the other, or always going to be fracturing. But a form of cultural accommodation dressed as convictional religion. The result is a religious respectability that promotes national unity, liberalism, and wokeism under the rhetorical guise of love for neighbor. Now, again, I just looked this up. This article is in the American Conservative, so, the only one that I reliably read in there for a long time has been Rod Dreher. But to have this be a little allergic to the woke, not a surprise. The result is a religious respectability that promotes national unity, liberalism, and wokeism under the rhetorical guise of love for neighbor. While Moore and his guests try to straddle the fence, there is little doubt that their biggest support is now coming from those significantly to their left politically. Now, just about everything Galli's about to say to that point, I agree with Galli, because in evangelicalism, for the most part, the money is on the right. When there's donor money in progressive evangelicalism, it's probably going to secular causes. Elite evangelicalism, represented by Christianity Today, InterVarsity Press, World Vision, Fuller Seminary, and a host of other establishment organizations, is too often a forum of cultural accommodation dressed as convictional religion. Now, you can read about those tensions really well in Molly Worthen's book. These evangelicals want to appear respectable to the elite of American culture. They have been a temptation since the emergence of contemporary evangelical in the late 1940s, the founding of Christianity Today being one example. Letters between first editor Carl Henry and founder Billy Graham suggest the desire to be, in essence, an acceptable fundamentalism, grounded in conservative theology while gaining the respect of secular academics and other cultural leaders. Galli is dead on right here. I mean, he's absolutely right. And those tensions have been there, and those tensions have fundamentally been evangelistic in nature. Those tensions also sit at the heart of a church like Willow Creek. And many of the mainline churches, or not the mainline, the mega churches, because these are evangelistic efforts and they are attempting to reach out to a population whose moral calibrations have continued to be changing. Okay? In other words, at the heart of this main group of neo-evangelicals is the desire to speak to the culture. That's going to put them in tension between, again, these old fundamentals and the new, especially the change in American culture. Now, again, in this podcast, many times I've talked about the fact that through the 20th century, really up until 9/11, or through the Cold War, the moral imagination of American Christianity and the broader public nominal moral imagination was very much in a line. What has been happening since the rise of the new atheists, the end of the Cold War, is that you've seen these things divide, which increasingly puts churches that have conservative traditional positions on a whole variety of issues increasingly out of step with the commanding heights of the culture, as in Hollywood and the rise of the Apple, Facebook, Google, Twitter, these significant cultural organs that in many ways have replaced magazines. Now, there's also another very interesting conversation going on. Oh, where did I find that? Oh, yeah, all the stuff going on around David Shore. David Shore is telling Democrats what they don't want to hear, by Ezra Klein in the New York Times. And there was also a significant one. Ooh, did I put the link to that one? Okay, a piece in Politico. Democrats' privileged college kids problem. In some ways, what Galli is writing about and what these pieces are writing about in terms of the Democratic Party have some parallel. There's a certain chasing of the cool kids going on. And it's not necessarily panning out well for the Democratic Party, at least the elements of the progressive that really want to go progressive, and the far more moderate Democrats, many of which are the kinds of people that I have lived with all my life, tending to be Christian African Americans. So there's a lot of stuff going on with this. Part of the reason I make PowerPoint is that if I don't sort of have something to stay on track with, my ADHD just pulls me all over the place. So back to Galli's piece. I also got to keep my eye on the time. You see also in the doctorates earned by many of Fuller's early professors. Rather than coming from safe evangelical institutions, it is clearly important for early professors to graduate from Harvard or Oxford or one of the European universities of some repute. Now, there's a ton of parallelism between Galli's piece here and the politics in the Christian Reformed Church and Calvin College, now Calvin University. When my father was graduating from Calvin Seminary, his classmates that would go on to, classmates of his generation that would go on to teach in academia would go back to the Free University, for example, and get their degrees there. So it's the parallelisms here are really quite notable. Also, one saw in the strategy of young life in the 1950s and 1960s, the key to find or convert one of the cool kids, athletes, cheerleaders, class presidents, etc., on the high school campus and encourage them to attend weekly meetings. Get the influencers, it was said, and you'll increase the number of kids who attend and eventually give their lives to Christ. Indeed, effective evangelicalism has been one motive, and in many ways it has proved to be an effective strategy. But I don't know that evangelicals have been sufficiently self-reflective to admit their basic and personal insecurities. It's just no fun being an outsider to a mainstream culture. We all just want to be loved, and if not loved, at least liked and respected. Elite evangelicals are not just savvy evangelists, but also people striving for acceptance. And again, if you look at Molly Worthen's book, this goes all the way back to the beginning of neo-evangelicals. I see this in my own sort of left side of the Christian Reformed Church culture. But this is deep in evangelicalism, and there is, in many ways, a basic insecurity about at least the diminishing power that the main line had, that, again, James Wellman wrote about, that Fourth Press had at the beginning of the 20th century. I saw this often when I was at Christianity Today. For the longest time, a thrill went through the office when Christianity Today, or evangelicalism in general, was mentioned in a positive vein by the New York Times or the Atlantic or other leading mainstream publications. The feeling in the air was, we made it, we're respected. This irritated me because I actually believed that Christianity Today's outlook was superior, since it was grounded in the truth of the gospel and not secularism. Now, again, there's a ton I could talk about in terms of secularism, Tom Holland, what secularism is, but this little line here, to me, makes a lot of sense of Galli going to Rome, because part of what we see in the dynamics of the Roman Church or the Orthodox Church is that in some ways there's a confidence in those traditions that Protestants, by nature of sort of their revolutionary posture, don't have. Orthodox and Catholics are looking to other sources for validation, justification, and status. I often commented that we had things backwards. The New York Times ought to be thrilled when it gets mentioned in Christianity Today. This tendency has only gotten worse, as now the mark of successful evangelical writers is to get published regularly in Times, Atlantic, and so forth. Now, there's a lot going on here, partly because evangelicals are always in their tension. They're always at cross pressures because they want to be popular, because numbers are critical to their own religious validations as well. And this is deep in the megachurch. And so you find all these tensions again in the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And, when it comes to someone like, let's say, Jordan Peterson, while his rise on YouTube was meteoric, his attack by the mass media, the liberal establishment mass media, the blue church, was also integral in his rise. And so even though, as Peterson and many others say, now Galli talked regularly about Peterson. In fact, one of his podcasts, so the small podcast, regular podcast of Christianity Today, Quick to Listen, Galli devoted an entire episode to Jordan Peterson and spoke favorably of Jordan Peterson. Galli also had an editorial critical of Trump that, of course, won acclaim from the left, but many noted that Galli sort of fired that one off as he was going out the door, and this again accentuates the fact that for most neo-evangelical establishment institutions, their donor base is further to the right, usually than the intelligentsia, the editors, the leaders of these neo-evangelical traditional organizations, Wheaton College, Christianity Today, these sorts of things. And if you listen to some of the people who are going to be writing comments in this video, that's the story they're going to tell. What's interesting about such pieces is that, A, such writers make a point that affirms the view of secular publications on topics like environmental care, racial injustice, sexual abuse, etc. And B, they preach to those pieces that evangelicals should take the same point of view. However, their writing doesn't reach the masses of evangelicals who take a contrary view and don't give a damn that what the New York Times says. And this is a critical piece. And we see this, I've seen this forever in the Christian Reformed Church. If you want to be a banner editor in the Christian Reformed in the Banner, and again the Banner has suffered the same fate of Christianity Today, if not more so. The Banner, which used to have in those which used to be, especially in those interwar years, was a weekly publication in the Christian Reformed Church, and in many ways was the cultural lifeblood of the denomination. Now it's sort of an organ that, well, I won't go into the banner right here. But his point here is very right, that emphasize what you can say. It's not about strategy at all. Emphasize what you can say, kind of don't go there in the places that it's different. Tim Keller does this masterfully, which is part of the reason why he'll get good write-ups in Christianity Today, better than he'll get in conservative branches in his own denomination. If these writers are really interested in getting those evangelicals to change their mind, the last place they should be is in the mainstream press. And this sentence, too, is so fundamentally key that, generally speaking, progressive evangelicals in these evangelical spaces, they stay in these evangelical spaces because in many ways their mission is to convert their other evangelicals to the right of them a little bit more to the left, to get them to flip on women in office, to get them to flip on being more accommodating of same-sex marriage, to get them basically in the stream of the cultural moral values. That's their mission. But ironically, so there's their Christian mission, their evangelistic mission, as it were, and they are looking for numbers as to validate them. They're solidly evangelicals, but what they don't know how to do often is actually talk well to the conservatives to the right of them, because what they really want is the validation of those in the broader liberal mainstream. They want the validation from the New York Times. They want to be written up in the New York Times. They want to be that nice Christian who's a little bit more crunchy than anything in the main line, who will get a nice piece in the Times or some other major organ. In other words, they're sort of continuing to climb the literary ladder, even though, hey, Atlantic, New York Times, those two, more than most, have been able to sort of make the jump into internet land and avoid inconsequentialism. The New York Times didn't make that. So in many ways, a lot of these really smart, college-educated, graduate evangelicals, not unlike the Democratic privileged college kid problem that's not Daniel Shore, that David Shore is pointing out, you have an echo of this problem in high-status neo-evangelical places as well. Because in many ways, these people know the balloons, the air's going out of the balloon of Christianity Today. And so their success in the podcast world, new lease on life. Maybe we can be relevant again. Maybe we can be popular again. Maybe we can be on the right side of history, but just kind of the right side of evangelical history. If these writers were really interested in getting these evangelicals to change their minds, the last place they should be is in the mainstream press. Better try to get a column published in the most popular Pentecostal outlet, Charisma. But that would do nothing to enhance the prestige of evangelicals among the culture's elites, and that will do nothing to maybe get you posted in the Atlantic or the New York Times, and maybe actually set you up in a really sweet career. Evangelical columns, in a large part, merely bolster the reputation of secular outlets, as these publications can now pat themselves on the back and say, see, even religious people agree with us. Rarely, if ever, do you see an evangelical byline in such outlets that argues to protect life in the womb or affirms traditional marriage, because that won't help their job prospects. Now, that sounds awfully crass, and maybe it is too crass, but it seems to be that's the direction, because Christianity Today ain't what it used to be. Even its former editor went to Rome. So again, back to what comes after the seeker movement is Young, Restless, and Reformed, an extreme of which is Doug Wilson. As he's going to say, really the Gospel Coalition is really the heir of that. Well, then you've got all sorts of other places like, oh, let's see if I put it up here. I did. Like Religion Dispatches that did that critique of the rise and fall of Mars Hill from the left, which is something that I've wanted to go through fairly carefully as well. This is the way it's flowing. And Galli names it. This is an astounding thing. Again, what does it say about our culture where a bombshell article is someone who dares to speak the truth in public? And again, it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that Galli was a fan of Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson. We see an ancient dynamic here. And this is where I start to differ with Galli, because I think his social critique is a little low resolution. We see an ancient dynamic here. When you seek to win the favor of the powerful, you will likely be used by them to enhance their status. That I agree with. And along the way, many of your convictions will be sidelined. Probably. We've seen this happen on the religious right in the political nightmare of the last few years, and I agree with Galli there too. But it happens on the left just as often, and I agree with that. I saw this accommodation dynamic as Christianity Today managing editor and their editor-in-chief. We said, for example, that the magazine did not take a stand in the complementarian or egalitarian debate. And again, they're right on the bubble where the Christian Reformed Church is trying to be. But and same with Willow Creek Association. Same with Alyssa Childers. But we rarely, if ever, publish an article that endorses complementarianism. Although, we'll sneak Tim Keller in. But he won't talk about it either. We did offer many that assumed egalitarianism in family and church life, not to mention the many women pastors who we published. Then there was the 6-day creation evolution debate, in which we again said we took no stand. But tried, and again, there's the Christian Reformed Church. There's the Willow Creek Association. I mean, there's all these sort of middle evangelical players who right now are just really being squeezed. And yet we published several articles that simply assumed a billion-year time span in the history of the earth. And again, these issues still matter for a lot of evangelicals. And if you don't believe me, read my comment section. It's not a coincidence that complementarianism and 6-day creationism are anathema to secularists, features of a religion out of touch with reality. Another example was accommodation of a more radical feminist worldview. Once I wrote a draft of an editorial arguing that traditional traits associated with masculinity, like competition, aggressiveness, this is before or after Jordan Peterson, were not intrinsically toxic, but needed in every human community, and yes, needed to be moderated. The reaction of 3 key staffers, 1 male and 2 female, was shock and fear. They assumed I was justifying such things as wife abuse, even though in my draft I twice condemned the phenomenon. As in, can't take yes for an answer. As in, spousal abuse, we need to keep mentioning that we're against spousal abuse. We sure have a reputation problem if we have to keep mentioning that. And by the way, I don't kick puppies, murder kittens, or enjoy the torturing of farm animals. All right, let's just get that out of the way. I put the editorial aside for the time because it was not worth the staff dynamics I would have had to navigate at the time, since I sensed their anxiety would be shared by many other staffers. I hadn't recognized how much fear and suspicion of masculinity pervaded the hallways. Well, they learned you good, didn't they? And it's true. It is true. I'm looking for some of the books that I've been reading, and yeah, really afraid of masculinity. Not unusual. Where would these privileged college kids have gotten those ideas? To be fair, I suspect no one reading New York Times and then deciding what they believed about such matters. Staffers came to these conclusions in their own ways, and I do not doubt their sincerity. One colleague of mine, I got to keep my eye on the time. One colleague of mine noted, he just put it so well to me. He basically said, people don't come to their pastors for guidance. they have their minds made up and they come to their pastors for validation or justification. But one reason they found themselves at Christianity Today and comfortable there was because the magazine was in sync with the mainstream media regarding many social issues. Now, again, what's interesting is that, Pope Francis is a darling in the media, but this gets into some of my center set and bounded set dynamic stuff that I want to apply to some rationality rules videos. But, he's a darling in those things, but women priests ain't going to see it. Affirming Roman Catholic Church ain't going to see it. And in a sense, the mainstream media sort of basically says, I said mainstream media. I don't like saying that. The mass media, the liberal elite mass media. That doesn't even go. See, I'm trying not to sound like a conservative pundit, but they've made up all the lines. But when they look at the Protestant churches, they think there's a chance because they move on these issues. They look at the Roman Catholic Church and it's like, they ain't going to go there. Let's just get a pope who's not going to sound like he's totally against it. Pro-life, of course, would be the great exception, as was the magazine's stand on the morality of homosexual unions. But as the years have gone by, we've seen more Christianity Today articles about how complex such issues are and that there are no easy answers. And I couldn't agree more. At the same time, anyone who studied the decline of mainline Christianity knows that such are the first signs of ethical retreat on such an issue. The slippery slope. It started with no easy answers and moved to here's an exception, to eventual full acceptance. And again, this is what many of you like to comment on my no easy answers, how complex videos that I make for hours and hours on these issues. But there we have it. But history is not a one-way street. And this is hardly an iron law. I'm not saying that Christianity Today or these other evangelical orgs are racing towards liberalism. I'm only saying that the temptation to be accepted by the larger culture is immense for reasons both evangelistic and psychological, and I agree 100%. That being said, authors Walters and Posey falsely imagine the source of liberal drift in such institutions. It's due to their being financed by radical liberal donors like the infamous George Soros. I can say with confidence, and Galli is 100% right here, to the degree that Christianity Today has liberalized, it has nothing to do with liberal donors. The opposite, in fact, is at play. One example of many, my infamous editorial about Mr. Trump was hailed by modern progressive evangelicals and deeply scorned by many of Christianity Today's mostly conservative donors, causing the administration no end of headaches. This dynamic also is at play at Fuller Seminary in the 1970s. The faculty was moving left in some ways, but the donor base was solidly right. I'd say this dynamic is probably happening at Wheaton College too, and I'm sure it's happening at Calvin University too. So you've got professors and retired professors who would really love to see the university move to the left. It's not going to happen. You've got progressives in the Christian Reformed Church that would like to see the denomination move to the left. It's not going to happen. Usually what happens is that those who are sort of to the left, who rise in the bureaucratic administration in the denominations or take over sort of the publishing organs, they usually go about as far to the left as the denomination will give them, and they'll pretty much stay right there, because when they take just one step over the line, and some of you will know exactly what I'm talking about, they will be found at Synod given a weeping mea culpa. I've witnessed a few of them. And so many of these more progressive in their communities have a very good sense of exactly where those lines are, and they have a very good sense of the safe communities to let everyone know what they really believe and then where they keep their mouths shut. They're really good at that. I understand that completely. People understand negative reinforcement works. I suspect that this is the main financial dynamic in every major evangelical institution that wants to move, however slowly or modestly, in what is perceived a more liberal direction. Dead on right. As for the alternative group to lead evangelicals in the future, it will be a group with some intellectual and psychological backbone. The psychological aspect is critical. Again, read Worthen's Apostle of Reason. Like Doug Wilson's, but not so idiosyncratic. And he's right, it won't be Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson will remain a fringe character. I'd offer the Gospel Coalition. And again, he's right. And in many ways, Gospel Coalition has taken over. So the young, restless, and Neo-Evangelicals have always been sort of a Presbyterian thing. And so to have a predominantly Presbyterian, even though you've got some Reformed Baptists in there, Acts 29 people, to have them really be the mantle bearers, yeah. Billy Graham was the celebrity pastor for Christianity Today. Tim Keller and John Piper, used to be Mark Driscoll, are the celebrity pastors for the Gospel Coalition. Galli's exactly right. It's a major force that someday could supplant Christianity Today as a major intellectual voice of conservative Christianity. I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the times have changed too much. We're not going to see the same dynamics. The Gospel Coalition, I don't think, is going anywhere, but they're not going to have, you're not going to see, well, Tim Keller's had some health issues. You're not going to see Kevin DeYoung fill up Yankee Stadium. You're not going to see John Piper fill up Yankee Stadium. That cultural, moral alignment that was there in the Cold War is gone. The Gospel Coalition might take over the mantle of Christianity Today because people can more broadly, in conservative Christianity, be comfortable with the Gospel Coalition's sort of temperature, but they'll never be what Christianity Today was, just like Tim Keller and John Piper. Tim Keller would probably be the one who had the biggest chance of doing what Billy Graham did, but the times are different. The times have changed. Despite the sheer number of populist religious right evangelicals, I don't take them seriously as a religious phenomenon. It is political with religious veneer. The Gospel Coalition has the finances and, more importantly, a substantive theological foundation to better resist the enticements of the cultural elite. Naturally, as a Catholic, as a now Catholic, see, if I say I, a bunch of you are going to say, yeah, I know you're cheering for me. Vanderklay's going to go to Rome. Others say the longer his beard grows, he's going to go the Orthodox. Here I am in the Dutch Calvinists, not planning any moves. I disagree with some Calvinist distinctives. Still one has to admire its architecture and depth and the Calvinist stubborn faithfulness to tenets that offend the surrounding culture. We are stubborn, as are the Dutch. We held back the Germans. We held back the British. We held back the French. We held back the North Sea. We're not going anywhere. And the Jewish side of me agrees. Evangelical religion has, and especially the Frisian side of me, evangelical religion has become theologically pluralistic and incoherent. This is the former editor of Christianity Today. Wow. As such, it is too subject to changing winds of secularism to stand erect in the hurricane of our times. The challenge of an organization like Christianity Today is that it aspires to lead the evangelical movement when there is no there. Currently, Christianity Today continues to do amazing work. Given the talents of its current editorial staff, administration, and board, I have no doubt it will continue to survive in these confusing times. Who exactly it will minister to and how large an influential group will be hard to say. Right, CT's day set with the Cold War and the magazine. And it's not going to survive on the rise and fall of Mars Hill. Of course, like every pundit, I will likely be proven wrong here and there, and perhaps more than that. But as someone embedded in the movement for 5 decades, I thought my views and experience might bring some clarity to the conversation. And he spoke the truth. You know, speaking the truth won't make you popular now, but, you know, that whole right side of history thing, it really doesn't depend on your theological persuasion as much as it depends on the truth, because the truth is durable. Politics is now, religion is always. So, yeah. Amazing. The times are getting more and more interesting. And, well, I'm out of time. Here we are. Let me know what you think. I'm publishing this one tomorrow. It's way too hot to keep.